Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again on Itamar. It's Friday, Parashat Divarim. We're beginning a new book of the Torah as we approach the end of the year, the book of Deuteronomy, Divarim. With Moshe Rabbeinu, basically this is the last 40 days of his life. It's on Rosh Chodesh Shvat, where he begins to tell the people of Israel, gathering the people of Israel in the plains of Avot Moab, right before they're ready to enter the land. And Moshe Rabbeinu for 40 days gathers all of Israel and is going over the entire Torah, review of the Torah, and adding a lot of other commandments, developing them, and getting Israel ready to enter the land of Israel. This time period, of course, is a difficult one for all of us as we mourn over our temples. But it's always a time period as well. We always must think about mourning, and the time of destruction is always a time to remember the rebirth, the redemption, and what we are looking forward to. This week I had a conversation with my wife. She said she read something very interesting. She was talking to me about how people are invest in the stock market. I was reading an article. And the last 14 years we see, like after a 7-year cycle, then this seems to be a crash in the market, and then it builds itself up again, and then after 7 years it crashed again. This happened the last 14 years. And it's very, very interesting because it happened on a sabbatical year, and we're beginning another sabbatical year coming up in just 2 months away. So it looks like we're heading for an additional, if we follow that cycle of the stock market, it seems like there perhaps could be another crash coming up. Now, when I heard these remarks, it was interesting, of course, how people, they're always making excuses. This time it's not going to happen, maybe it won't. But in reality, what is stocks all about? I'm not a financial advisor or anyone like that, but the whole concept of stocks, people are putting their faith in all kinds of businesses, right? And what they believe perhaps may go up, and whatever it is their faith is putting it in the materialistic world. Again, don't get me wrong, I'm not here to tell you to invest or not to invest. I'm just trying to use this, of course, for our introduction for our class today. But an interesting point. If you really want to know something you can probably invest in that you 100% will never be disappointed, and that, of course, is Torah in all ways. And I want to show you how the words of the prophets, as we all know, when we read the prophet in the synagogue on Shabbat, before we read the prophet, we say a blessing before, and then we say a blessing. We say a group of blessings after we finish reading it. And part of the blessing we say, "B'davar echad midvarecha achola yeshuv rekam." One word, even one word of what you say in the prophet's God, the way God told us, will not be fulfilled. In other words, every single word that the prophets tell us will be 100% fulfilled. So we know we're investing our faith and putting our faith in something. When we're putting our faith in Hashem and in the prophets of Hashem, we know 100% will never be disappointed. We'll only benefit, and our stocks will only go up. So that's an introduction to this class. I want to begin this portion and connecting again to what we're talking about. But first, if we go back and we look in the beginning of the Torah, we're not far away from there. Believe it or not, the year cycle goes by. Everything is cycles over here. Well, if you look in the portion of Lech Lecha, which is Genesis 15, and talks about the covenant of Abraham, the Brit Ben Abtarim, the famous covenant of the halves. And it says, I'm going to read verse number, again, as I mentioned, chapter 15, verse number 18. It says, Bayomahu karat Hashem et Avram Brit Lemor. In those days, God made a covenant with Abraham, saying, Lezaracha natati et haaretz hazot, to your children I have given the land, min nahar Mitzrayim, from the river of Egypt, ad nahar Gadol, Nahar Prat, until the Euphrates River. And then it says in verse 19, 20 and 21, it lists 10 different nations that Israel will be inheriting. It says Hakeni, vet Hakenizi, vet Hakadmoni, vet Hachiti, vet Haperizi, vet Harifaim, vet Hamori, vet Haknani, vet Hagashi, vet Hayevusi. Okay, 10 nations. Now, it's very, very fascinating and interesting. We look in the Bible, we look in the Torah, in the land of Canaan, Israel had to, in reality, cope with the seven. We always talk about the 7 nations. We talk about the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim are the Chivi. Literally means giants, but they refer to the Chivi. Og Melech HaBashan, for example, that's part of the Rephaim. Vet HaAmori, Vet HaKnani, Vet HaGirgashi, Vet HaYevusi. Right? We all hear about them very, very, very often as we read the portions of the Torah, as we read the book of Joshua and watch Israel capturing the land. That began, of course, in the book of Bamidbar, Numbers, where Moshe Rabbeinu captures Sichon and Og. We read about the Hamori, and we read about, again, I told you, the Rephaim, which are the Chivi. So the question, in reality, what I'm trying to get to is, what happened to the Keni, the Kenizi, and the Kadmoni? There are three nations here that are not mentioned. We don't deal with them once we enter the land. What happened to these three nations? That Abraham in the Brit Bein HaBetarim, in the covenant of the halves, is told that Hashem will give us as inheritance those places as well. And it's very, very interesting, and I'm going to bring now, if we look, well, first I'll bring down over here the words of Rashi. Rashi explains it very well. Rashi says on the verse here of Brit Bein HaBetarim, Rashi brings down, Eser umot yeshkan, there are 10 nations here. V'lo natan lehem ela shiva goyim, but God at the end gave us the land of 7 nations. Vashlosha, because the other 3, who are they? And Rashi reveals to us which they are. Edom, Moav, Ammon, the Edomites, the Moavites, and the Ammonites. Hein, Keni, Kenizi, Kadmoni, those are the 3 nations here. Atidim liot Yerusha, they will be a future inheritance of Israel. And he brings down Isaiah chapter 11, which we'll get to in a moment. So Rashi is saying right now, this is something in the future. It's not something that's happening now. So Israel is destined to inherit in the future the 3 different nations. Now, I would like to first, in this portion itself, bring down some verses where we see how careful we have to relate to those 3 nations, that we are not, at this point entering the land, we are not allowed yet to inherit their places. And it's brought down, and as Rashi mentioned, we're talking about the Edomites, the Moavites, and the Ammonites. So if we look in, I'll start a little bit further back. If we look in the book of Deuteronomy, our portion, chapter 2, and verse number 1. I'm going to read a couple of these verses, and we're going to continue. It says, "Vanefen vanisa midbara," and we turned and we traveled to the desert, derech Yamsuf, through Yamsuf, through the Red Sea. Kasher diber Hashem elai, v'nasavet har Seir yamim rabim. We went around the mountains of Seir for many days, and Hashem says like this: "Vayom Hashem elai." God says to me, Moses is talking, Moshe Rabbeinu. He says, "Rav lachem sovet ha'ar hazeh." Enough. Are you going around this mountain? Panu lachem tzafon, go north. V'ta'am tzav leimu atem ovrim b'gvul achechem b'nei Esav, and tell your people, your nation, that you are going through the borders of Esav, which dwell in Seir. V'yiru mikem, they will be afraid of you. V'nishmar temod, be very careful. Al tidgaru bam, don't challenge them. Don't entice them, bring them into battle. Ki lo eten lechem ma'atzam ad midrach kafraga, because I will not give you their land for even a little piece. Ki Yerusha le'Esav natati et har Esav, because I've given it to inheritance to Esav, Edom. So here we see something very interesting. At this point in time, when Moshe Rabbeinu was gathering Israel, and right, the last 40 days of his life, and going through the Torah, and he's reviewing and telling us about the fact is that we weren't allowed to put foot on the land of Esav at all, of Esau, of Edom, at this time at all. And what God was warning us not to, because it was given to Esav, it was given to them as inheritance. Then it goes on to say, and then we continue to go through the desert of Arava. Then we got to the Moavites. And God says, don't again, surround the Moabites. Val tidgal b'milchama, don't go to war with them. Ki lo etein lecha me'atzah, because I will not give you from its their land. Ki livnei lo natati et al Yerusha, because I've given it to the children of Lot. Et al was the major city of Lot, Abraham's nephew. Right, and it talks about that. Then it goes on to talk about in verse 12. I'll skip over that. I'm sorry. We'll go to the next area, which is Ammon, which is in verse number 17. Vaydaber Hashem Elai, God spoke to me, saying, "Ata over hayom et gvul Moav et Ar." Today you're going to pass through the Moabites. V'karavta mul bnei Ammon. You're going to get close to the Ammonites. Al titzureim, al tidgal bam. Don't again surround them. Don't entice them to battle. Right? This was also inheritance of Lot, the nephew of Abraham. So basically, we see something very, very interesting. We see when Moshe Rabbeinu talks to the people of Israel, and God was telling very clearly to Israel, that you cannot entice, you can't try to drag them into battle, these nations, the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites. But as they continued to go forward, they dealt, of course, later on with Sichon Melech HaEmori, with Sichon the king of Amori, and Og Melech HaBashan, and Og the king of Bashan. This was still the other part of the Jordan. So they were. God was telling them, go to them into battle. From them, you are going to go to battle, wage battle against them. But the point I'm trying to make here is it's very fascinating. We see how things are so exact, that these particular nations, God is saying, don't you dare go into their land. And to the other nations, to Sichon and God's saying, go into the land, and you go to battle. Of course, when you enter the land of Israel, of course, we were told to capture and inherit the land of Israel, which is all of the land of Israel beyond the Jordan River on the west side. Obviously, all that land, Israel was commanded to capture. Another Joshua. Obviously, that was done, and later on, of course, through King David, we see Israel capturing the land, recapturing, taking the land which was our rightful inheritance. But we see there's such a very, very exact, what we call there's like a word in Yiddish, cheshbon, which is a cheshbon, an accounting, how Hashem is so careful about everything. And what makes it even more fascinating is that later on, as I just read to you, well, first of all, the beginning of history, about Abraham, in the future, we were told that Israel is going to have the area of Esav and Ammon and Moab. That area of Transjordan will become part of Israel. Not only, of course, the tribal portions of Reuven and Gad and half of Menashe, but the further southern areas, or further south, further east as well, of the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Edomites. So it is really interesting that later on in the future, that will be part of Israel's inheritance. But at this time, Israel was not ready, because it wasn't mature. So we see that when God has his cheshbon, makes his calculations, everything is extremely exact by the T. Now I want to bring down, what I mentioned before about the covenant of the halves, we saw Rashi quotes Isaiah, and I'd like to open up Isaiah chapter 11, which is a fascinating chapter which talks about the future here, and this can help us understand part of what's going on, of course. If we look in Isaiah, let's open up the chapter here a moment. Isaiah begins, it's a chapter of Messiah, of course. It's a chapter of the end of days. If we look around, it says, it opens up in first, I'll read to you for some of the first opening verses, which are always fascinating me. It's a beautiful chapter. It says, V'yatsa choter megezer Yishai, v'netzer misharashav Yifre. The staff will come out of the Geza Yishai. A Geza refers to a tree, right? A tree trunk that has been cut, right? So obviously, all of a sudden there will be now a staff coming out of Yishai, who was the father of King David. It's referring, a chota can also refer to a branch. V'netzim mishal shav yifren, from the roots, a branch will come forth. So here the prophet is talking about, again, the future, the end of days. V'nacha lav ruach Hashem. Now who is this branch? Who is this staff? Refers, of course, to Messiah. V'nachal av ruach Hashem, and God's Spirit will come upon him. Chokhmah, wisdom, bina, understanding. Ruach Eitzah, spirit of Eitzah refers to giving advice. Gvura, Gvura refers to might. Ruach Da'at, understanding, and the Yirat Hashem, and the fear of Hashem. So we see we are going to have a leader, a spiritual leader of Messiah. Baricho b'yirat Hashem v'lo lemarei nav yishpot. He's not going to judge by his eyes. V'lo lemishmao znav yochiach. V'shafat b'tzedek. Right? He's not going to, again, the Messiah is going to be a perfect judge of perfect tzedek, means honesty, of true justice. B'tzedek dalim, to judge the poor. B'ochiach b'misho la'an ve'aretz, and the modest of the land. V'ika eretz b'shevet piv, v'ruach sfatav yamit rasha. And it says he will strike the ground with the rod of his mouth, which means he's going to have tremendous influence of his teaching, and his example, the spirit of his lips, he will smite the evil. So first of all, we see we're talking about this great time of when the Messiah will come about. Vayat tzedek ezol matnav, and he will place on his loins righteousness. That's what he'll wear as his belt. Vemunah ezol chalatzav, and faith, that will be his ezol, that will be his belt. Vegar ze'ev im keves, and the ze'ev, the wolf, will be able to dwell with the sheep. V'namer in gedir bats, and a leopard with a little goat. Ve'egel ukfir meri yachdav, the same thing, a lion with a calf. V'nar katon noheg bam, a little child will be able to lead them. We see some very powerful imagery here of the prophet talks about the end of days, of how righteousness will rule, how the staff, of course, of Yishai will come back. Right now we're in a situation where we're moving towards this process of redemption, and the prophets, just like they prophesied the return of Israel to the land and the rebuilding, the physical rebuilding of our land, and we see here we're talking about, of course, about our spiritual rebuilding. We can't forget about that. You know, what is the whole understanding, the Jewish understanding of Messiah is a spiritual. There are two parts of Messiah according to, in Judaism we talk about the Messiah of Joseph, who's involved in the materialistic building of the land, the gathering of the exiles. And upon that there will come another layer, which will be the spiritual layer, the Chotem Megezi Yishai, that staff, the rod from Yishai, who will lead Israel in a spiritual redemption, will bring about righteousness and bring about justice to mankind. And this we see with the words here, and it will have an effect. We can understand it, of course, as a mashal, a parable, with all the animals having peace with one another, but in reality, we see something very deep. The entire world, the nature will change. There will be a great change in nature. And it talks about ufarav adov terani yachdav. The cow and the bear will go into pasture together. And the lion, just like the cow, will eat straw. In other words, everyone's going to become vegetarians. Even the animals will be eating vegetarian. It's something, the whole world's going to go through a major change here. And it goes on to say, a child's going to actually be able to play on the hole of a snake, a python. Right? Amazing change is going to take place. And later on, after we continue reading, I'm going to skip over, which I want to get back to what we were talking about a moment ago. If we look in the verses further down, it talks about those nations again that we spoke about. Rashi brings those nations down. And it says, Vaya b'yomu Yosif Hashem shenit yado. And would be in those days, God again will add his hand liknot et shalamo, to bring back the rest of his nations. And here the rest of the nation of Israel, right? He's talking about the 10 tribes that they're still missing. They're gone, part of them. They're coming back slowly, but some of those tribes are still not here. Asher yishael b'Ashur u'Mitzrayim Patros u'Mikush. So they're still Meilam, they're still beyond the Jordan, and Mishinar, and the Babylonian, this whole area we're talking about. Mechamat u'Miyayam, they're scattered in the islands over the sea. So we see at the end of days that Messiah is going to bring back those lost tribes. V'nasan nes lagoyim v'asaf nidchei Yisrael. And it will be like a banner to the nations, and he will gather the exiles of Israel. Unefutzot Yehuda yikabetz me'arba kanvot haaretz. And the scattering of Judah will be gathered from all four corners of the world. So we see here there is a mixture of things happening. Right now, Judah's been bringing back, over for many years, we've been coming back Judah. But of course, it's referring to the other places of the scattered, the 10 tribes as well. V'sara kinat Ephraim, v'tzorei Yehuda yikaretu. Ephraim lo yikanet Yehuda, v'Yehuda lo yatzor et Ephraim. And there will be no more jealousy between Ephraim and Judah. So we see that rip between our own people, our tribes. There'll be peace amongst us. And now it talks about, finally getting to the nations again, we spoke about before. Then it says, Va'afu bekatev plishtim yama, yachdav yavozu et bnei kedem, Edom u'Moav mishloch yadam, u'bnei Ammon mishmatam. So it talks about now, those three nations that Israel will inherit. It talks about the Moabites, it talks about the Ammonites, and it talks about the Edomites. So here, we see right here, this is what Rashi brought down in the verse, that only at the end of the days when Mashiach is coming and the world's going to change, Israel is going to return, or going to receive those areas, those other three nations that God promised in the covenant with Abraham, that they'll be part of Israel. Isaiah is saying it right out over here, that will be eventually be part of the house of Israel in the future. But that didn't happen yet. That will happen in the future. Now, getting back to what we were saying before, and I wanted to make this clear, this whole thing, we see that there's a timetable. We see that the way Hashem works, is very, 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 very exact in all ways the way Hashem works, His world and how He manages the world. And of course, we always say, we know that our actions can speed up making things happen quickly. Right here, the word used, va'afu. Afu means they flew, literally, right? Things can happen much faster, as Isaiah says over here. It will happen very quickly when it happens. But we have to be very, very aware and pay attention to these nuances in the world. Right now, and it's very important to mention this, we are in a time where the world is, fighting this corona for the last year and a half, and we thought we saw the end of it, but it's getting worse. And I spoke about this many times over, how, okay, let's say, God willing, we get over the corona, but there'll be something else. Until we put our minds and we focus on the real problem and the real issue, get to the core of the issue, we're going to be constantly bombarded with other issues and other terrible things to have to cope with. And whether it is financial crises, or whether it's going to be a health crisis, whether it's going to be natural disasters. I mean, God is sending the signs out here to wake up and to realize that we must take a change. What is the whole purpose of everything that's going on in the world? What is the purpose of our temple that we're crying about, that it's not rebuilt yet? If it's not to bring light to the world, to be a house of light. From Zion will come forth the Torah. Ki mitzion teitzei Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. It's the source of all light from Torah is Zion. And as long as our temple is not rebuilt, and as long as we're not going forward, God forbid, we're going to see symptoms, results, all kinds of things coming up, all kinds of bad things that are going to come about because we are not moving forward in the process of redemption and not thinking about it. The whole concept of why in Judaism was everyone is like so surprised. Here we are thousands of years praying. Let our eyes behold the return of Zion. For thousands of years we're praying it, and it's happening. Here we're coming back because we know what faith is. And I said we put our faith in the most important thing in the prophets, and knowing that we're going to come back. And just as we have that faith and we continue to pray for it, we're going to see the change, of course, as the prophets talk about it. But in reality, it's a process, and we have to try our best in our lifetimes, as long as we have the ability and the strength to do good and to go forward and make things change, to try to make those changes take place. We can't sit around and not do anything for the sake of heaven. We have to work hard and make it happen. And that is really what Tisha B'Av is all about. I mean, our temples were destroyed, and we're continuing to mourn. Here we are in the land. A lot of people say, why do we have to keep fasting? We're in the land. Of course, but it's not over yet. We have a lot more work to do. We have to go forward and see As I said before, put your faith in the stock market of the prophets. Everything they say is going to come true. We got to go forward, and the part of the fast is to continue to remember, to feel the lacking of what our temple would be, what kind of inspiration it would be for the world if it was standing. And that is really all about what were the portions we're reading. The book of Bamidbar was all about the desert. It was about Israel, different crises in the desert. We were being pampered, and by Hashem giving us the man, and giving us our clothes, and all kinds of help that we received, and being bad, and then being good again, and bad, and punished. It was literally like going to nursery school. And slowly we were maturing as a nation, and now, if we pay attention to the last few portions, last week we read about the borders of the land. We were approaching Israel, and now we were getting ready. We read a lot about the daughters of Tzlofchad, how important it was for them to receive inheritance in the land. And now in Divarim, always reflecting, Moshe Rabbeinu was saying, you know something, you're only 11 days away. When you came out and we said, okay, send the spies from Kadesh Barnea, you're only 11 days away from entering the land. What happened? Instead of Alei Resh, go inherit the land. It's very simple, 2 words. Alei Resh, go up and inherit the land. That's all we have to do. But no, they put fear in the hearts of Israel. 10 out of 12 spies. And that resulted in a huge turnaround. A huge turnaround. And unfortunately, that 11-day traveling turned into 38 years, additional years of the desert, where Israel could have totally been in the land and brought about already, and we could have gone forward in the footsteps of Messiah then, way back. But of course, we have the free will concept. The book of Divarim is all about our choice. Choose life over death, choosing good over evil. And that is such an important concept, is that we have free will in this world. And that's really what delays everything. God, the prophets tell us what's going to be in the end. At the end, it will happen. But we have to be strong and steadfast in our faith and do what we have to make the footsteps of redemption go forward. And that's really our message. The story of Tisha B'Av, the destruction of the temple, Israel could have literally brought about an immediate redemption process, but they despised the land. The destruction of our temple has all to do with the way we relate to the land of Israel. If we show our love and our everlasting devotion to the land, God will bring back our temple. We rebuild Jerusalem, and we will be a light to the nations. It's all based on that. And the Jews that remain outside of Israel are making a grave mistake. And they have wake-up call day and night. God is sending them wake-up calls. The time is to come home now, to sell your homes and to leave exile and come back to the land. This is what God told way back to Abraham. And that voice that was told to Abraham should be heard in every Jewish heart, saying it's time to return home to the land. Because when people justify and they maintain their lives as Jews outside the land of Israel, they're delaying the redemption of the entire world. And of course, this is exactly why we didn't merit in the land, because we despised the beautiful Eretz Chemda, the land of our Chemda, our love. Vayimasu be'eretz Chemda. That's what they did. And that night that they despised, when they came back with the evil report, turned out to be Tisha B'Av. And God was saying, remember, you're crying for no reason. I'm going to give you a reason to cry, and your temples will be destroyed. So the whole understanding of the rebuilding of our temple is to understand our connection to the land. This brings us back to the 10 nations that God promised Abraham. This is your land of your inheritance. Later on, there'll be 3 more. Beyond the other side, the land of Ammon, Moab, and the land of Edom, that's part of the land, that's part of the promise. Later on, it doesn't say how it's going to happen. Later on, in the future, Israel will inherit those lands. Isaiah is hinting to it over here, saying it right out. It will happen. We have to understand how. It's just, and in what way that Hashem is going to make that part of the prophecy come true. But it's fascinating to see that everything has its time and place, and we have to, of course, we have our time and place. We have to do whatever we can to make a change. While we're in this world, let us go forward and bring about the next stage of our redemption. Shabbat Shalom, Besorot Tovot, Yeshuot V'Nechamot.